We were sitting in the corner booth of our favorite bar, the dim lighting wrapping us in a false sense of privacy. What started as a casual double date with our closest friends, Hannah and Jake, turned into something I never expected. A conversation that would make me question everything about my marriage, my boundaries, and myself. That night, the unthinkable happened, and nothing was ever the same again. Ethan and I had been married for 6 years. We prided ourselves on being the kind of couple everyone admired, adventurous, open-minded, and deeply connected. From hiking treacherous trails to spontaneous karaoke nights, our relationship was built on trust and a shared willingness to embrace the unknown. We weren't perfect, of course, no couple is, but we always made each other feel like we could handle anything as long as we were together. Then there were Hannah and Jake. They were like our mirror image in so many ways. Married for 5 years, they shared our love for spontaneity and adventure. We met them through mutual friends, and over time, our casual acquaintanceship turned into a genuine friendship. Double dates, game nights, even weekend camping trips. It wasn't long before we became inseparable. With them, everything always felt easy, natural, and full of laughter. That's how the night started, at least. Just the 4 of us tucked away in the corner booth of a cozy bar we often visited. The atmosphere was perfect, soft lighting, the hum of conversation all around us, and the clink of glasses in the background. We laughed, reminisced, and shared embarrassing stories as we always did. It was comfortable, familiar. But there was something else in the air that night, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Maybe it was the way Hannah and Jake's glances lingered just a little too long, or the way Ethan's hand brushed mine under the table. Not with affection, but with nervous energy. Whatever it was, it made me hyper-aware of everything around me. The weight of Ethan's presence next to me, the way Hannah's laugh seemed sharper than usual, the occasional look Jake would shoot across the table. As the evening went on, the conversation took a turn. It started with harmless confessions, high school crushes, cringeworthy moments from our pasts. But then Hannah leaned in, her eyes sparkling with mischief, and said something that made my heart skip a beat. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to try something different? Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and suddenly, the night felt anything but familiar. Hannah's question lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to try something different? Her tone was casual, almost teasing, but the intensity in her eyes said otherwise. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to gauge whether this was some kind of joke. But her smile didn't waver, and I knew she was serious. Ethan shifted beside me, his hand brushing against mine under the table. The gesture wasn't comforting, it felt more like a signal. Was it reassurance? A question? A warning? I couldn't tell, and that unsettled me even more. I looked across the table at Jake, expecting him to laugh it off, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned back, his arm draped casually over the back of Hannah's chair, though his posture betrayed a tension he couldn't quite hide. Jake was the one to speak next. You mean, stepping out of the box? Breaking some rules? His voice was calm, but the edge of curiosity was unmistakable. I swallowed hard, glancing at Ethan, silently willing him to say something, to defuse whatever was happening. But his face was unreadable, his expression carefully neutral. That was the thing about Ethan. He was impossible to read when I needed him to be the most transparent. Finally, I managed a laugh, though it sounded awkward even to my own ears. Okay, Hannah, I said, hoping humor would diffuse the tension. What exactly are we talking about here? Because if this is about trying karaoke again, Ethan still hasn't forgiven you for the last time. Hannah laughed, but her grin stayed sharp. Not karaoke, she said, waving her hand dismissively. I'm talking about sharing experiences. Exploring new connections. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. Sharing experiences. Connections. It was vague enough to leave room for doubt, but pointed enough to make me understand exactly what she was suggesting. I looked at Ethan again, but he was staring at his drink, his jaw tight. My mind raced. Was he considering this? Did he want me to say something first? Jake finally spoke, his voice lower this time. We've been talking about how much the 4 of us click, he said, his words slow and deliberate. How easy it is to talk, to connect. It got us wondering, what if we pushed that connection further? My pulse quickened. You mean hypothetically, right? I asked, trying to keep my tone light. But even as I said it, I knew this wasn't hypothetical for them. I could see it in the way Jake avoided direct eye contact, in the way Hannah leaned in as if daring us to take the bait. Of course, Hannah said smoothly. This doesn't have to be anything serious. Just a conversation. No pressure, no expectations. But it didn't feel that way. The weight of the unspoken tension was almost suffocating, and I could feel the boundaries of our friendship shifting right in front of me. I glanced at Ethan again, and this time he met my eyes. There was something there, curiosity, maybe, or something darker. Whatever it was, I knew he was thinking about it too. "All right," Ethan said finally, his voice steady but quiet. "Let's talk." The words felt like a crack in the dam, and I wasn't sure if it was a relief or a warning of the flood to come. Hannah's grin widened, and Jake nodded, his expression calm but watchful. As the conversation continued, I found myself hyper-aware of every detail. The way Ethan's hand stayed just out of reach of mine, the way Jake's gaze lingered on Hannah when she spoke, the occasional flicker of hesitation in her voice. None of this felt as simple as they were making it out to be. "What exactly are we supposed to talk about?" I asked, forcing myself to sound composed. "Ground rules? Expectations? Or are we just diving into the deep end?" Hannah leaned back, her grin softening into something almost thoughtful. "That depends on all of us, doesn't it?" she said. "This only works if there's trust. If there's no judgment, trust." That word carried so much weight, especially now. I looked at Ethan, hoping for some kind of anchor, but his expression was unreadable again. Instead, his hand found mine under the table, his touch grounding me, but not in the way I needed. It wasn't reassurance. It was a question. A quiet, subtle "what now?" The tension was palpable, the air thick with possibilities none of us had dared to name outright. And for the first time that night, I wasn't sure if I was more afraid of what would happen if we crossed the line, or what would happen if we didn't. The bar felt darker as the conversation deepened, as though the dim lighting was conspiring to blur the lines between what was right and what was forbidden. Hannah leaned forward, her fingers playing with the edge of her glass, her gaze flickering between Ethan and me. There was something daring in her expression, something that dared us to say no, or maybe dared us to say yes. "Look," Hannah said softly, her voice carrying the kind of intimacy usually reserved for secrets. "No one's saying we rush into anything. This is just a thought, a conversation. Worst-case scenario, we laugh it off and move on, but it didn't feel that simple. Not to me." Ethan's hand brushed mine under the table again, but this time it wasn't subtle. It lingered, his fingers curling gently around mine. I glanced at him, trying to read his expression, but his face was a carefully constructed mask. The calm exterior he wore so well only made my heart race faster. "We've always been adventurous," Ethan said finally, his voice measured but deliberate. "But something like this, it's not just an adventure. It's more complicated than that." Hannah's grin softened into something warmer. "Of course it is," she said. "That's why we're talking about it. Because if we ever did explore this, it would only work with people we trust." That word again, trust. It felt like a double-edged sword. Trust was the foundation of everything Ethan and I had built together. But wasn't it also what made this entire conversation possible? If I didn't trust him, if we didn't trust them, this would have been laughable. But instead, it felt dangerously real. Jake finally spoke up, his voice steady but quieter than before. "This isn't something we have to decide tonight," he said. "It's not even something we have to decide at all. We just wanted to be honest about where our heads have been. About what we've been curious about." Curious. The word hung in the air, innocent on the surface but heavy with meaning. I took a sip of my drink, the cool liquid doing little to calm the heat rising in my chest. My thoughts raced, caught between a dozen questions I didn't dare say out loud. Was this really about curiosity? Or was there something deeper driving this conversation? Something none of us were ready to admit? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "This feels like a lot to unpack." Hannah leaned back, her smile still in place but her eyes sharper now. "It is," she admitted. "But sometimes unpacking things leads to places you didn't expect. Good places." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I glanced at Ethan again, and this time I caught it, that flicker of curiosity he was trying so hard to hide. It wasn't just in his eyes, it was in the way he held himself, the tension in his shoulders, the way his thumb brushed against my hand like he was testing the waters. And then Jake's voice broke through the haze. "We don't want to pressure you," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "That's not what this is about. We just wanted to open the door. Whether you walk through it or not is completely up to you." The door. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. I could feel it in the air between us. A door cracked open just enough to see the possibilities on the other side. But stepping through meant crossing a line we couldn't uncross, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for that. What happens if it doesn't work? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. What happens if this changes everything in a way we can't come back from? For the first time, Hannah's confidence faltered. That's a risk, she admitted. But isn't everything worth having a risk? Her words landed heavier than I expected. I looked at Ethan, hoping for some kind of anchor, but instead I saw the same mix of fear and curiosity reflected in his eyes that I felt in my chest. We had always been adventurous, always willing to push boundaries together. But this boundary felt different. This wasn't just about trying something new. This was about us. Jake's voice was softer this time, almost reassuring. We're not saying this has to go anywhere, he said. But sometimes stepping out of your comfort zone brings people closer. Makes them stronger. Closer. Stronger. I couldn't tell if his words were hopeful or manipulative, and the ambiguity made my pulse quicken. I felt Ethan's grip on my hand tighten slightly, a silent question I couldn't answer. The tension between the four of us was palpable, thick enough to feel like a weight pressing down on my chest. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice quiet but steady. We'd have to be sure, he said, looking at Jake, then Hannah, and finally at me. Sure that this wouldn't hurt us. Sure that this is something we could handle. Hannah's smile returned, softer this time. That's the beauty of it, she said. We don't have to decide tonight. We don't even have to decide at all. But the fact that we're talking about it, that says something, doesn't it? Her words felt like both an invitation and a challenge, and I didn't know how to respond. All I knew was that something had shifted between us. And no matter what we decided, things would never feel the same again. The conversation slowed, but the tension didn't dissipate. It lingered, filling the space between us as the night wore on. Hannah and Jake kept exchanging subtle glances, their dynamic now more noticeable. Jake's hand rested on the back of Hannah's chair, but his grip tightened occasionally, like he was holding on to something unspoken. Hannah, meanwhile, leaned into her words, her confidence unwavering, though her eyes flickered with something deeper, something unsure. I wasn't sure how much longer we could sit there with this weight between us. Every laugh felt forced, every word chosen too carefully. I glanced at Ethan, searching his face for some kind of anchor, but his expression remained neutral, his calmness infuriatingly unreadable. I wanted him to say something, to take the lead, to give me a signal, but he stayed silent. Then Hannah leaned forward again, her voice dropping to something almost conspiratorial. Let's not overthink this, she said softly, her eyes locking onto mine. No one's saying we do anything crazy. Let's just see where the conversation takes us. That's all. Jake nodded, his voice calm but deliberate. Right. No pressure. Just curiosity. There it was again. That word, curiosity. It sounded innocent enough, but it carried so much weight. My mind raced with questions I didn't dare say out loud. Was this really just curiosity for them? Or had they been planning this, waiting for the right moment to bring it up? And what about Ethan? Did his silence mean he was as torn as I was? Or was he quietly waiting for me to take the reins? Okay, Ethan said finally, his voice measured. If we're talking about curiosity, let's be honest. What are we even talking about here? Hypotheticals? Ideas? Or something more concrete? His words felt like a crack in the dam, and I braced myself for what would follow. Hannah's grin widened, and she shot a quick glance at Jake before answering. We're talking about trust, she said. About stepping outside of our comfort zones. About exploring something new. Together. Together, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. The word felt heavier than I expected. Laden with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to unpack. Hannah nodded, her expression softening. Look, I know this sounds unconventional, but we've all seen how well we click. The four of us, there's something special here. And Jake and I, we've talked about this before. If we ever wanted to explore something like this, it would have to be with people we trust. People who get us. Jake leaned forward then, his tone serious but not unkind. We're not saying this is something we dive into headfirst, he said. But the connection we all share. It's worth exploring, don't you think? The connection. I couldn't deny that it was there, that our friendship with Hannah and Jake had always felt easy and natural. But this was something else entirely. This was uncharted territory, and the thought of stepping into it made my stomach twist with equal parts fear and intrigue. Have you two thought about this before? I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. Hannah hesitated, her confidence faltering for the first time that night. We've talked about it, she admitted. The idea of broadening our experiences. But we've never acted on it. Not with anyone. And honestly, we'd never even consider it if it weren't with you. Her words were disarming in their honesty, but they didn't make the decision any easier. I looked at Ethan, hoping for some kind of clarity, but his gaze was fixed on the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass. I don't know, I said finally, my voice trembling. This feels like a lot to unpack. Jake nodded slowly. It is, he said. But sometimes the things worth unpacking are the ones that bring you closer. Closer. The word sent a shiver down my spine. I felt Ethan's hand tighten around mine, a silent question I still didn't know how to answer. The weight of the moment was almost suffocating, the air between us thick with possibilities I couldn't begin to process. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. What happens if it doesn't work, he asked, his voice low but steady. What if this changes things in a way we can't come back from? Hannah's expression softened, and for the first time that night, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. That's always a risk, she said quietly. But isn't everything worth having a risk? Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, none of us spoke. The weight of the unspoken was almost unbearable, and I felt my chest tighten with the pressure of it all. I glanced at Ethan again, searching his face for something. Anything that would help me make sense of what I was feeling. And then, in a move that caught me completely off guard, Ethan turned to me, his eyes searching mine. What do you think, Rachel? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want to do? His question sent my mind spiraling. What did I want? Did I want to take the leap, to see where this path might lead? Or did I want to hold on to the safety and stability of what we already had? The truth was I didn't know. All I knew was that this moment, this choice, felt like a turning point, and whatever decision we made, there would be no going back. I don't know, I admitted finally, my voice trembling. I don't know what to think. Jake cleared his throat, his tone softer now. You don't have to decide tonight, he said. We can leave it here, let it sit. There's no pressure. But even as he said it, I could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on all of us. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was a door we were all standing in front of, waiting for someone to turn the handle. And deep down, I knew that once it opened, there'd be no going back. As the four of us sat in silence, the tension between us palpable, I realized something. This wasn't just about curiosity or trust. This was about us, about the choices we made and the risks we were willing to take. And no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. The days after that night felt heavier than I expected. Nothing explicit had happened. We hadn't crossed the line, but the weight of the conversation lingered. It was as though a door had been cracked open, and even though we hadn't walked through it, I couldn't stop thinking about what might lie on the other side. Ethan and I didn't talk about it immediately. Instead, we moved through our routines as if everything was normal. We cooked dinner together, we watched our favorite TV shows, we laughed at the same old jokes. But underneath it all, there was an unspoken tension, a quiet hum that reminded me of what we weren't saying. I could tell Ethan was wrestling with his own thoughts. He wasn't one to share his feelings easily, but I caught him staring into space more often than usual, his fingers tapping absently on the counter or the arm of the couch. I wanted to ask him what he was thinking, but I was afraid of the answer. Was he curious? Did he want this? Did I? The silence finally broke one evening after dinner. Ethan was drying the dishes while I put away leftovers, and the quiet between us felt too loud to ignore. Without looking at me, he said, So, have you thought about what Hannah and Jake said? The question caught me off guard, even though I'd been expecting it. I set down the container in my hands and turned to face him. I have, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. But I don't know what to think. Ethan nodded, his hands stilling on the dish towel. Me neither, he said. It's complicated. That was an understatement. There was nothing simple about what Hannah and Jake had proposed. It wasn't just about curiosity or trust. It was about crossing boundaries we'd never even thought about before. And once crossed, there would be no going back. What scares me the most, I said finally, is the idea that this could change us in a way we can't undo. Ethan met my eyes then, his expression serious. It could, he said. But it could also bring us closer. His words hung in the air, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. Closer. That's what Jake had said too. But was that really what this was about? Or was it just a justification for something none of us wanted to admit? I don't know if I'm ready for this, I said softly. And I don't know if I ever will be. Ethan nodded, his gaze steady. That's okay, he said. We don't have to do anything we're not ready for. But I think we owe it to each other to be honest about how we feel. Honesty. The word felt heavier than it should have. I thought about all the things I hadn't said, not just about that night, but about everything. About how I sometimes felt like we'd fallen into a routine, like we'd stopped challenging each other. About how I missed the excitement we used to share, the sense of adventure that had brought us together in the first place. About how much I wanted to feel alive again. But was this the way to do it? Was this the way to rediscover that spark, that connection? Or was it a risk too big to take? When we finally talked to Hannah and Jake again, the tension was palpable. We met at their house for a casual dinner, but the air between us was anything but casual. Hannah's smile was as warm as ever, but her eyes betrayed her nerves. Jake, usually so composed, seemed restless, his hand gripping his beer bottle a little too tightly. "I guess we should address the elephant in the room," Hannah said with a laugh, breaking the ice. "We didn't mean to make things weird the other night." "You didn't," Ethan said quickly, his voice calm. "It's just a lot to think about." Hannah nodded, her smile softening. "Of course. And we get it. This isn't something you just jump into. We just wanted to be honest about where we're coming from. But there's no pressure. None at all. But there was pressure, unspoken but present. It was in the way Jake's eyes flicked to Ethan, in the way Hannah's voice softened when she addressed me, in the way the air seemed to thicken every time the conversation veered too close to the subject we were all dancing around. By the end of the night, I felt drained. As Ethan and I drove home, the silence between us was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that carried meaning, that said more than words ever could. When we got home, we sat together on the couch, not saying a word, just letting the weight of it all settle over us. And in that silence, I realized something. This wasn't just about Hannah and Jake, or the idea they had introduced. This was about us, about our marriage, our connection, and the choices we made together. Whether or not we ever walked through that door, we had already changed. The question now was whether we could navigate those changes together. "I don't have all the answers," Ethan said finally, his voice breaking the quiet. "But I know one thing, I want to figure this out with you. Whatever that looks like." I nodded, leaning into him as his arm wrapped around me. "Me too," I said. "No matter what happens, we figure it out together." And in that moment, I knew we'd be okay. Maybe we'd never walk through that door, or maybe we would. But whatever we decided, we would decide it together. And that was what mattered most. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and I talked more than we had in years. Not just about that night with Hannah and Jake, but about us, about the things we'd let slip into the background of our marriage. The conversations weren't always easy. Sometimes they were raw, uncomfortable, forcing us to confront truths we'd both avoided for too long. But they were necessary. And as difficult as they were, they brought us closer. I realized how much we'd settled into a rhythm that, while comfortable, had dulled the spark that had once defined us. It wasn't that we didn't love each other. We did deeply, but somewhere along the way, we'd stopped challenging ourselves and each other. The routines, the predictability, the comfort, they had created a distance we hadn't even noticed until it was brought into sharp focus. Hannah and Jake had unintentionally done us a favor. By opening that door, they forced us to look at ourselves, to ask questions we hadn't dared to ask. Were we satisfied? Were we still growing together? And most importantly, were we brave enough to face the answers, no matter what they were? Ethan and I decided not to take things further with Hannah and Jake. It wasn't an easy decision. We cared about them deeply, and the connection we shared with them was undeniable. But in the end, we realized that what we needed wasn't found outside our marriage. It was found within it. The conversation they started had reignited something between us, and that was where we wanted to focus our energy. When we told Hannah and Jake, they were understanding. A little disappointed, maybe, but understanding nonetheless. "The most important thing is that you're doing what's right for you," Hannah said, her smile as warm as ever. "We just wanted to be honest about where we were. And we're glad it helped you be honest with yourselves too." Her words stayed with me. Honesty. That was what this had all been about. Not just with Ethan, but with myself. I had spent so long avoiding certain truths, about my fears, my desires, my insecurities. But now, for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could face them head-on. Ethan and I started carving out more time for each other. We went on dates again, real ones where we left work and worries behind and just enjoyed being together. We tried new things, took spontaneous trips, and found ways to surprise each other. It wasn't about rekindling something that had been lost. It was about building something new, something stronger. I learned that love isn't about avoiding discomfort or playing it safe. It's about taking risks, sometimes big, sometimes small, but always together. It's about asking the hard questions, even when you're afraid of the answers, and trusting that the foundation you've built is strong enough to withstand the weight of them. Looking back now, I'm grateful for that night, for the uncomfortable truths it forced us to confront. It wasn't just a conversation, it was a turning point. A reminder that love is as much about growth as it is about comfort, as much about change as it is about stability. Hannah and Jake remain close friends, and though the dynamic between us has shifted, it hasn't diminished. If anything, it's deepened, built on a foundation of honesty and trust that few friendships ever reach. And Ethan and I, we're stronger than we've ever been. Not because we avoided the door that night, but because we faced it together and chose what was right for us. Love, I've learned, isn't about following someone else's rules or expectations. It's about creating your own, one choice at a time. And in the end, those choices are what define you, not just as a couple, but as individuals willing to grow, to trust, and to take on the world together. What would you do if your closest friends challenged everything you thought you knew about love and trust? Would you take the leap or walk away? My story isn't just about a single decision. It's about the courage to face the truth and grow together. What would your choice be? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, and stay tuned for the next one.